Death is painful, I've learned that, and even when it's expected. It's also a mystery. Loved ones would ask me to assure them that their departed one was in a better place. I quickly learned I'm no authority on the afterlife.
So much of our conception of death is what is comforting to us. I think a lot of unhappy people have this really fatalistic conception of death, and so I think being free of a doctrine allows me to have more comfort in it.
I always had a lot of logical problems with the Christian view of death, and so I honestly feel less afraid now because nothing happening after you die feels way less scary to me than hell.
Welcome to Forsaking Faith, where we tackle these and other thoughts through discussion and contemplation.
This is Heather Bailey and Christine Goodrich. Our podcast explores the journey from fundamentalist Christianity to non-belief by examining the deep and nuanced effects of deconversion.
While some ex-Christians focus on the negative aspects of their past, we want to emphasize how leaving Christianity is a complicated process that brings both pain and joy. It is both loss and liberation. While we lose structure, community, and stability, we gain empowerment and agency.
We want to create a space for thoughtful discussion in this spirit, and we invite you all to join us. In this episode, we both discuss our anxieties about death before and after deconversion. While I was more anxious about death after the whole deconversion process, Christine has actually found some peace regarding death, which I think is very interesting. We both seem to have come to an acceptance about it, and we also see how it has shaped our lives since we gave up on the idea of an afterlife. But we do have some contrasting viewpoints. Christine begins by sharing her fear of martyrdom, describing that she had never felt good enough for God's love another way, and thought martyrdom and torture might be the only way she could truly show her dedication to God. She describes how, because of its finality, she thinks about dying often now that she's not a Christian, but how she also has come to a peace with it in a really touching way.
Heather didn't have anxieties about death when she was a believer, which was different than me. She felt comfort in her eternity, like the afterlife was where she was going to have peace and happiness. And she didn't engage with philosophies on death in literature that she read or in conversation because she had this confidence in an afterlife. So she actually says that she felt sorry for some of the people who did engage in this, who didn't have as much confidence in their afterlife. She remembers that when she finally realized that death was final, she was actually watching a movie, and she shares her story about that. She says she still has anxiety about the finality of death because she fears losing her consciousness and her sense of self. And even though I've thought that in the past, I've sort of triumphed over that. And so it's really interesting to see how her journey is overlapping with some of the thoughts that I used to have. Most of my feelings about death are really immediate. They also belong in two categories: what I'm doing before I die and how I actually go. I think about death all of the time. I always think about what will happen if I die. When I get off the phone with a friend, I wonder if what I said to that person would be satisfactory if they died or I died. I definitely want to feel comfortable with death, or rather my life before an inevitable death. When I was a Christian, I was kind of confused about death in the afterlife. Even in the Bible, it's not concrete. There's a lot of muddled information. It's hard to picture. The book of Revelation is very strange and hard to relate to. Also, some of it doesn't even seem enjoyable.
This is so interesting. You just said that there was a lot of muddled information in the Bible about death, but did anything stand out to you in particular?
Yeah, definitely. I thought a lot about the martyrs in the Bible because I have serious anxiety about torture. I still have this anxiety. I went to a torture museum recently and I had to leave. I think I just have physical empathy when I read gory things or see gory images that actually occurred. In Christianity, a martyr's death is laudable. They're respected, like Rachel Scott was for a while from the tragedy at Columbine, if you remember. Now, the fear of torture in me is still alive, though I do think dying for something you believe in is beautiful. But now I think about all the other martyrs from other religions, and now I have more peace in the sense that I no longer think that I have to be a martyr to be glorified. I always thought that if I wanted to be in the upper echelons in the Christianity hierarchy that I would have to be a martyr, since I had no desire to be a pastor or worship leader. I'm astounded by Peter and other martyrs in their mental determination to be willing not just to die for their faith, but to be mutilated and hurt for their faith.
Wow. I've never really thought about that before, to think about the ways in which you are still considering what it would be like to be a martyr, even though you're no longer a Christian. Is there a way in which you would still be a martyr now? In other words, is there a cause or a belief that you would be willing to be tortured for?
Tortured? I don't know. I have thought about this recently. Like, what is my purpose? What would I die for? I do, because I have this understanding that death is final, it changes that idea of being willing to die for something. Because when you're a Christian, you think dying for something, you get this prize afterwards. But it's sort of thankless now that I'm not a Christian to die for something. And so I don't know if there's anything I would die for. Maybe my daughter. But this understanding that it's final is huge. I probably would, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't choose to die for her instead of her dying. Otherwise, I don't know. It would have to be a really strong belief. Probably other people. I'd imagine that standing up for other people would be something I would die for. Now, being tortured is an entirely different world, and I don't think, not having that experience myself, that I could make the decision about that ahead of time. I don't know if I have the wherewithal to withstand torture. I'm not really sure what my answer to that is at the moment. For me, dying is really frightening, and I was really scared. To go away from the martyrdom, I think about when I drive past a tractor trailer, the guardrail that's there. I always imagine the tractor trailer swerving and me like going over the guardrail or being smashed. It's awful. And I think about it every time I pass a tractor trailer, and I still think about it. It's not something that has kind of gone away. And I didn't think about that when I was a Christian. I don't know why. I don't know why death scares me so much more. I mean, it's the finality of it, I think, but otherwise, I don't know. So I still think of these things, but more from an awareness that I could die at any point, instead of an unwelcome worry that I will be judged after I die, So I've come to that peace from a very different way than Christianity provides. The fact that I don't have to think about a reward system or a separation from good and bad is actually a source of my peace. I like that I don't have to worry about that.
So this is really interesting what you're saying, because you're suggesting that for you, there's a way in which you're more anxious now that you're no longer a Christian, and as you described, right, the actual process of death, but that you do have a peace in a different kind of way, in that you're no longer thinking about your actions as having some sort of eternal consequence for you.
Right. I don't have to be a martyr. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit more about that? Is there something specifically an action that you engaged in that you used to worry about, that you thought, this action is going to potentially hinder my chances of getting into heaven?
It's funny. Sort of my lingering, and I think I'll probably talk about this in a later podcast, but I still have lingering faith. That darkness that's over you, that's like, maybe you're wrong. Maybe you shouldn't, be a glutton. For the most part, I'm sort of freed. I was worried about any sort of emotional feeling I would have towards a male or female at the time that wasn't based in some pure moral structure. You know what I'm saying? So that feeling has changed. Now I don't worry about who I look at or how I look at them, except in the politically correct sense. now it's more about a social acceptance than it is about a God acceptance, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So it's funny. I still am worried about death, but I kind of came to this place of peace when I had my little girl. When she was really little, very, very little, in her maybe 1 or 2 months, I would watch her fall asleep, and I admired how she trusts and welcomes sleep, that it's a part of her life that she just accepts. She doesn't anticipate the next day or worry about her not enjoying it or even not waking up to it. So I thought, what a simple life to just be content with sleep. And I thought, how is that really different than being content with death?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is so beautiful. I'm really interested in what you were saying about how your daughter's approach to sleeping is, you're trying to think of this as you're approaching death and as you're thinking about death now, and that she's giving you this, having this experience of being a mom has given you this source of peace. And I'm wondering about the flip side of this. Are there other ways in which having a child has actually caused you to have more anxiety about death? And again, especially given the fact that you're no longer a Christian.
My reflections on my Christian faith has changed how I would be a mother, definitely. One of the, and I can't, thank God, I can't say what scripture and verse it's from. I'm actually feeling really good about the fact that I can't say what it's from, but there's the scripture about train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So that actually gives me a little bit of anxiety, and I want my daughter to come to the realization that she doesn't need faith. Maybe or maybe not. Maybe she does need faith. Maybe it's something that will strengthen her journey in life or something. But I want her to come to those conclusions on her own. And so not introducing her to the church, not bringing her to Sunday school is a huge choice, because I grew up with that. So am I giving her like a different opportunity? Am I giving her a bias there? And then if I'm wrong, am I screwing over my daughter? Is she gonna die and go to hell or whatever? There's as if she believes and she dies and it's not true, then it's fine, Or if she doesn't believe and she dies and it is true, then she's probably going to hell. But I don't, gladly, I really don't think that that's what will happen. But still, there's definitely some lingering stuff there, which actually, leads into my final thought about the fact that when I'm close to death, I'll probably pray, even though I don't believe in God. I always imagine myself in like a lame B movie, floating with a life jacket, waiting to drown, crying out to something to help me and not knowing what I'm crying out to. So I have a small seed of doubt in my non-belief, and it ebbs and flows. Sometimes it's a big seed of doubt. Sometimes it's a little seed of doubt. Sometimes it's not there at all. But I know that someday there is this chance that I might believe again. And this is primarily because of my belief in the finality of death. So thinking about death as much as I do benefited my relationships too, because I always wanted to leave an interaction in a positive way with my friends and family. I want to feel okay that was my last interaction. And this allows me to have patience with people and motivates me to check up on them and maintain relationships. I also want to be doing something that I'm content with when I die. In this way, the recognition of mortality would be my relationship, if anything could be.
Mm-hmm. I think this is such an incredibly healthy attitude to have. It's one that I admire about you and wish I could develop further in my own life. Can you give me an example of a way in which having this recognition of mortality has encouraged you to do something that makes you content, maybe where, as otherwise you would be, wouldn't have had the courage, or incentive to pursue this when you were a Christian?
Yeah. Well, So I'm not sure if it's different from when I was a Christian. I still quit a lot of stuff when I was a Christian, and I still did a lot of. I mean, I'm not sure that my outlook on Christianity has changed this, but definitely my recognition or mortality has changed the goals that I want to attain. I'm currently on a leave of absence from my PhD, and part of that is from the fact that I was so burned out and depressed about the work I was doing, and I didn't really enjoy the work that I was doing. And I think part of my willingness to take this leave and reflection is that fear that if I die and I'm still doing this project that I don't enjoy or I don't see a good end for, I think that depression, that unwillingness to die in that depression kind of let me say, okay, maybe I need to back away from this for a little while and reflect. I've definitely made this an action in my life. It has given me strength to do things that I wouldn't have done before.
Yes, that's so important. That's a really beautiful place to be in, I think, coming out of this journey and finding a place in which you can, again, develop a kind of different approach to understanding and your own mortality that has actually allowed you to stop something that's making you unhappy when you need to stop. So it's so interesting, Chrissy. I've had such a different experience in a lot of ways from you. And my journey has been quite different, especially when it comes to my conception of death. I think a lot of that just has to do with the timing. So you and I are really different in this way because I came to this long process of deconversion quite a bit later than you did. And so as a result, I didn't ever have these anxieties about death when I was a teenager, and even when I was an undergrad in my first 4 years of college. I really didn't worry about death because I still firmly believed that heaven was real and I was going to heaven. And so I remember the way this affected me in a lot of the literature courses that I took as an undergrad. And for you listeners out there, just to give you some context here, I am getting my PhD in English literature now. So there's some irony to be had here because when I was an undergrad, I took some English classes, and a lot of the conversations I didn't really connect with when we were talking about the way that literature explores death, because I just had such a confidence in my own self about what was going to happen when I died. And it prevented me from engaging in those conversations in a real way. I had an arrogance about me. I kind of had this, I pity everyone else in my classroom who is worried about this, and I pity these writers who are expressing anxieties about death. So definitely had that kind of arrogant attitude. And my thoughts, my only anxieties in relation to dying were really pretty silly and superficial anxieties. I remember, being worried about whether or not I would have fun in heaven. And I loved worship. I loved singing and dancing. Christine and I, our Christian Fundamentalist church, had dancing and, vibrant music in the worship service. So worship was certainly fun to some extent, certainly more fun probably than those of you who are listening who come from a more traditional, structured Christian service background. But I still had those concerns. And I also had the concern that I think a lot of you can probably relate to, which is the worry about, dying a virgin, and would I die before I ever experienced sex? Because of course, at this point in my life, I was very committed to the idea of waiting until I was married to have sex. So there was this limitation that I had put on myself. I couldn't just go out and have this experience in the moment when I wanted it. So I was very worried about that. I thought to myself, I should have sex before I'm floating around in a cloud.
That's funny. I remember thinking about that on an airplane once. Like, if this plane goes down, CF5 isn't looking too shabby. I don't know how I would have sex with that person before the plane actually fell down. But, I definitely had that thought. So actually, I was wondering if any of those fears that you've read in the literature, has anyone in particular struck you as a good thought process about death, or having a good view on death?
Yes, certainly. Now and again, as someone who studies literature, there's lots of beautiful moments in different texts that describe death in all sorts of different ways, often as a kind of a second journey, often as just going to sleep, sometimes in ways sometimes the descriptions of death are very blunt, but again in a way that feels reassuring. I'm specifically thinking of one example in William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, which very famously one of the characters is grieving the death of his mother and has this memory in which he remembers fishing, and he remembers the moment in which he guts a dead fish. And so in his mind, he equates his mother to a fish, and he asks one of his older siblings, is my mother a fish? And it's a kind of, very, very famous line from that novel that really sort of captures all of the ironies and to understanding death and understanding the human body. There's lots in literature about the human body as a machine that just essentially gets unplugged, or as an animal, that just ends. So yes, I have gotten to that point, but what had to happen first was I had to have that moment of panic and fear, and I still experience this, but the moment that it first happened, I can remember vividly, which is interesting because it's such a random, very specific moment in my life, and I don't know why it was triggered in this way at this particular moment, other than to say that I was already kind of changing at this point in my life. But this was when I was in graduate school for the first time. So I was getting my master's degree, and I was living outside of the country and living around different people that I hadn't been exposed to before. So that's the context. And anyway, my friends and I were watching one of the Alien films, and I essentially had a panic attack. I'm sitting around with my friends. The lights are off. There's a moment where the characters are, as happens in every Alien film, there's a bunch of characters with guns, walking into a dark territory, and then the alien is trying to kill them and eventually succeeds in killing all of them, but a couple of the lucky ones. And I remember finally thinking about how final death is. And this is not by any means the first violent film that I watched. But when I was a Christian, the violence didn't really register for me. I think, again, because I just thought, whatever, you go to heaven. Right. Who cares? Right. So this was the first moment when I thought that this is going to happen to me at some point.
I definitely, I don't think you're going to be torn apart by an alien. but I do see your point. So how do you feel about death now that you've gotten through the process?
So I don't believe heaven exists anymore because of this loss of faith that I've experienced. And that I'm still at a point. I think I'm not quite where you are at right now, Christine. I think that I still have a lot of anxiety about the finality of death. And for me, it's sort of the opposite of you. I'm not as concerned about the process of dying. I think of course not for everyone, but for quite a few people it happens very suddenly, or you're in a hospital and you're so drugged up anyway that you're sort of not even aware necessarily of what's going on. So I'm not so much afraid of that. I am very afraid of the fact that it's just an unknown, what happens afterwards. And I already, given my personality type, I have a very type A personality. So I already don't deal well with unknowns and ambiguity. I'm the kind of person that likes, even if something's challenging or scary, I just like to know what's going to happen. So that's what scares me the most about death. And because I don't have a book that I can read to give me, the what to expect after death book, like you do with childbirth or these kinds of things. So, and the Bible was that for me. So when I was a Christian, I had this very clear book that I could read, and it gave me that peace of mind. So I think the existential questions, are also interesting, right? What it means to me to have a consciousness. What happens when I lose that consciousness? So I'm also interested in those questions, but it's all grounded in a very real fear of what I don't know. We don't know. No one knows.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's definitely interesting because before your consciousness stayed alive, you were still you.
Mm-hmm.
And now you don't just lose your body, you lose you. So that's an interesting thought, since before, basically your essence, your consciousness, who you were, stayed alive. And now all of you sort of, not sort of, definitely passes away and disappears from the earth, disappears from history, unless you've made a big impact. So that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people think about that, not just people who were originally Christians, but I think generally a lot of people worry about losing that consciousness, which, to me is a little funny because I think that you're not going to know. It's final. Right. And so why are you worrying about the inability to worry? It is, it's definitely a unique thought that I think a lot of people have.
Right.
So yeah. So I don't think you're alone there.
Right. I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of, it's funny that you said that, worry about the inability to worry, which is something that especially those of us who are type A's, I think we thrive off of worrying and like having the next deadline. Certainly in my own PhD, this is what I'm doing, and this is kind of what drives me. So yes, that there is definitely that worry. And then there's also a whole bunch of other worries that have affected me because I'm not thinking anymore about eternal consequences, right? So whether or not I go to heaven or hell. But that actually creates new anxieties for me because, and this is so fundamental, I think, to the shift that's happened for me, because as a Christian, I thought to myself, if something bad happened to me, I was able to cope with it because I could say, well, this life is short and fleeting and it doesn't matter anyway because when I die, I'm going to heaven. I'm going to have this perfect life with God for the rest of eternity. And so it was a comfort and a, security blanket that I could sort of put on myself when anything happened to me in my life. So, for example, if I didn't get into the graduate school that I originally wanted to get into, I could just say, well, this isn't what God wants for me, and it doesn't matter anyway, ultimately, because I know I have an eternal life. So what has happened since I no longer have that is I find myself much more anxious about my day-to-day decisions and the consequences that those decisions are having. And it's both good and bad. It's really interesting. So in some ways it's good because it's made me a more proactive person. I'm much more likely now to, if I see that there's a problem with something that I'm unhappy about in the world, I will try to take action. Or if I want something in my life, I will do what I can on my end, at least, to accomplish that. this podcast is a really good example of that. Christine and I said there's this thing that we're experiencing, and we don't feel like there's enough community and support for this, for experiencing this process of losing faith. So let's do something about it. Let's be proactive. So in that sense, it's really positive. But the negative side to that is that I have a lot more anxiety because it feels like there's more pressure on me to always be making the right decisions. And what if I don't make the right decision? Then I can't fall back on this idea that, well, whatever, God is ultimately in control, and ultimately I'm going to heaven. So there's more pressure for me to make my existence count because I only have this one life, because I'm not anticipating an eternal life. So, and then there's one other thing that I also want to highlight that for me, which has been certainly something that has affected me, and that is that when you have family members who are still Christian fundamentalists, it is very devastating for them because they genuinely believe that you're going to hell. And that's, I think, hard for people who don't come from a Christian fundamentalist background to really understand, because this isn't like my parents' approach to this isn't, oh, cool, like you do you believe whatever you want to believe. That's awesome. Their approach is, oh my God, pun intended, I guess. Our daughter that we love is destined for a eternal life of Satan and, hellfire and pain. And it's very real to them. It's a very real belief to them. And so it makes my own unbelief for them devastating.
Yeah, that's really deep. It's a very deep kind of pain, definitely.
It's a very deep pain, yeah. And so, because of course you don't want your kids going to hell. I can understand from my parents' perspective, if you genuinely believe that then they feel like they failed and they're very concerned about this. So it's certainly affected. And I think this is something Christine and I will probably explore in a later podcast in more detail. We'll talk about our parents, our relationship with our parents. So I'll leave it on that for today, but just to say that it certainly has deeply affected my relationship with my parents.
A theme that we've both sort of talked about throughout this podcast is this ability to be proactive about our lives, this ability to take that agency for ourselves that we talked about. And the negatives of, that we both we have similarities on are this uneasiness that comes with losing faith, that comes with leaving faith. So you can see both that uneasiness and that empowerment coming through in this change, through even the as morbid an idea of death. You can see this willingness to take a responsibility for our own lives while having this uneasiness or this unwanted negative feelings that maybe come from our parents or come from within or come from having children. And so I think that those positive and negative aspects are really interesting. And I'd like to hear from our listeners how they can see both of those things in our life.
Okay. Right. So, yes, I completely agree, Christine. I think that there's this, what we're both highlighting is this kind of a volatileness as a result of this process of losing faith, in that there are both things that we can celebrate. There is a sense that we have more agency in some ways about what we're doing with our lives here and now. The focus on the here and now can be really empowering and a huge motivator. But then there is also this anxiety about it, because it's also this idea that this is all we have. The here and now is all that we have. We don't have a future life. And so I just want to also echo what Christine said, that we would love to hear from all of you about, we'd love to hear your responses to what we're saying. And also if you want to share your own stories about how you've coped with death and understanding death as a result of losing your faith, we invite you all to do that.
We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. We want to thank our friends Luke Emmerich, Amy, and the anonymous woman who has provided us with great reflections for the past 3 weeks. We also want to extend a huge thank you to all of you, our listeners. We're truly grateful for your support, and we hope you keep listening. And please contact us, because we'd love to hear more about your journey.
If you would like to contact us, you may email us. Our email address is forsakingfaith@gmail.com. You can also tweet us at Forsaking Faith, or like our Facebook page, which is called Forsaking Faith. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, and we would also appreciate it if you would leave us a review so that more people can find us. Stay tuned as we wrap up this episode with our artistic segment, which we hope will further inspire you as you reflect on what you've just heard.
The working class. With money zipping by us in the race to stay alive, we buy First Lieutenant Crunch to assert trying to get by. You see, survival we can handle, proof resides between our gums, but thrill comes only in the shape of a good lay under come. Sex is our Christmas morning, our childish craving. We're obsessed, our appetite not settled, preferring intercourse to rest. A multitude of children this libidinousness breeds, our farming birthing briars when we sow our fertile seeds. Our ugly off-white icebox tightly clutches our provisions, and we contend for the last cookie with concentrated competition. We won't be baked below the breadline, no large fear of fatal famine, but we will never eat our crackers with eggs from Alaskan salmon. Public schools force competition with a plethora of pencils, while rich kids get a choice electing occupation stencils, later whining to their senators on how we spend their taxes, then denying pleas for raise. Fuck their pretentious faxes. Our perspiration holds a sale sign, $7.25 per hour. With opportunity we fail, knowing only how to cower. Obama and O'Connor won the rise against depression, but from my daddy's fruit of labor, I inherit his depression. Collectively, until we die, we sense we're out of place, an empty space within a poem, or a line that doesn't rhyme. Reading Happiness for Dummies to fix our mental case, but though we battle for success, we can't beat the strike of time.